Continuing to break down the fallout of the current banking crisis, what are the next steps that lawmakers are taking to make sure this does not happen to other banks in the future? Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland, is joining us now to discuss. Senator, thank you so much for being with us, first of all. Obviously, you guys have been paying attention to this. There were hearings earlier this week to try to figure out what next steps are. What is your sort of initial thinking here as to what Congress needs to do?
Well, it's great to be with you. And I think we had a very informative hearing, but I also think we need to dig even more deeply as we go. The one area where there's emerging bipartisan consensus is that we need to expand the authorities of federal regulators like the FDIC to claw back compensation taken by CEOs and top executives whose own negligence contributed to the meltdown of a bank like Silicon Valley Bank. As you know, under DoddFrank, there are provisions that allow the clawback of compensation proceeds from stock sales when it comes to the biggest banks. But there are some loopholes with respect to banks that are under that, not so big. So there is bipartisan consensus that we've got to do that. And of course, one of the hopes of doing that is it would deter riskier behavior if some of the decision makers knew that their own stock proceeds, sales, in the case, for example, of the SVB CEO who sold $3.6 million in company stock 10 days out, that would have some deterrent effect on excessive risk taking.
Senator, we do know that the FDIC is now considering making sure that in order to shore up the insurance fund, that some of the largest banks are actually paying a higher portion than they currently are into that fund. What is your perspective on that, and how should the banks be stepping up to ensure that at the end of the day, the broader system is more secure?
Well, I think it's appropriate to ask the biggest banks to contribute more to the overall insurance of the system. But this is a part of the ongoing conversation here. And, part of the conversation is what needs to be done legislatively. The other part of the conversation is, what can we push the feds and the other regulators to do to be able to better detect and react to the kind of situations we saw at SVB. One of the things we've learned is that they were on to some of the problems at SVB. And then the question is, what options did they have to act before the final meltdown? Could they have exercised some of those options earlier? Or do you have to wait until, a crisis hits? I do think that they moved very quickly, and I think they moved effectively once there was a crisis. But what more could be done earlier when they detected signs of problems? To react to prevent it from getting to a crisis point.
Senator, I'm always curious to hear what members of Congress are hearing from their constituents. So I would ask you that in this situation. And obviously, in this case, your constituents include both banks that are based in the state of Maryland, as well as individuals and businesses who have their money at banks. And so I'm curious what you're hearing from them on sort of both sides of that.
Well, one of the things we hear from constituents all the time is no bailouts for banks whose own negligence caused their problems. And as you well know, the Biden administration did not provide any bailout to Silicon Valley Bank or their investors or anybody else who had a stake in the bank. So,
and do you think that people understand that? Do you think people are, have sort of grasped that it wasn't a bailout, or do they still have questions about that?
I think there's some remaining questions about it, and part of that question relates to this issue of again clawing back compensation, because while there was no bailout of the investors, we all know that, for example, the CEO took that big stock sale proceeds 10 days out. And so I think sometimes people see that and they think somehow, they got bailed out. The bank did not get bailed out. The investors did not get bailed out. But this is why it really is important that we find ways to claw back proceeds, because people who are responsible for decisions that collapsed a bank should not be able to, make profits or get compensation from that bank. Certainly not in close proximity at the time that it went under and had to be taken over by the FDIC. But so you're right. We're having to make clear this is not 2008 when there was a bailout of the banks. This is a very different response.
In the wake of this banking turmoil, though, are there specific either checks or stress tests even, or any type of reporting that lawmakers are considering adding on to the current kind of framework that banks have to adhere to in order to make sure that we avoid this in the future?
Well, yes. Look, I'm one of those who believes it was a mistake to, roll back the part of the DoddFrank oversight provisions, the stricter scrutiny provisions that applied to a bank the size of SVB. I still think that could be a contributing factor to what happened. But in the meantime, as we talk about legislatively trying to plug that hole or fix things, we are asking the Federal Reserve and the regulators of the Federal Reserve to maximize their existing authority, even under that amended version of Dodd-Frank, because they do have the authority to do even more than they were. So many of us are pushing them to do that. I will say there's there's a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking. I got a lot of my colleagues on the Senate Banking Committee and a lot on the Republican side who in the weeks and months leading up to this collapse were actually pushing the Federal Reserve to lay off, to not be such tough regulators. The good news is now, they're no longer calling for greater relaxation, but they're pointing their fingers at the same folks that they asked to back off. In this case, we're still getting all the details about what was known by the regulators and what was not. And I think based on that further information, we'll be able to maybe come up with another legislative package. But again, for now, the bipartisan consensus revolves around the compensation clawback provisions.
Senator, I want to, if I could, turn to another issue of great importance to the markets here, besides what's going on with the banks, and that's the debt ceiling. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of bipartisan consensus, does there? I mean, what message would you have for market participants and Americans, for that matter, at this point about, how long we're going to be seeing this debate, whether Washington can come to agreement on this?
Well, you're absolutely right. That's a great concern that I share. And, the sad part about this is there is a very simple fix, which is we could vote today to make sure that the United States preserves its full faith and credit. It'd be a simple vote. You could even do it in a way that gives the president the authority to raise the debt ceiling subject to a congressional override, something that Senator Mitch McConnell has proposed and we've implemented in the past. The problem is pretty straightforward. You have the Republican-controlled House refusing to pass the law to make sure that we preserve our full faith and credit. And instead, they've taken the position that we've got to adopt their very, in my view, right-wing radical proposals as the price that we pay to make sure that the country pays its bills on time. Well, that's just not the way it works. These are not Republican bills. They're not Democratic bills. They're Uncle Sam's bills. We are more than happy to have a conversation over budget issues. And in fact, President Biden submitted his budget plan. It's got $3 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. So we're asking House Republicans to put their plan on the table, put their budget plan on the table. We've not seen it because we don't think they've been able to get a majority together to support any particular proposal. So, put your plan on the table, but let's not threaten that the United States won't pay its bills on time. That would have catastrophic economic consequences.
And then finally, if I can turn to one more issue that I really want to get your view on, Senator, and that's the issue of gun control. We just heard the president say he has come to sort of the limits of his powers as executive to implement changes on gun control, sort of putting it back to Congress. Have we lost in this country on gun control? Is that it? Is this just what it's going to be?
I think it's absolutely shameful that we haven't been able to muster the votes to pass more comprehensive common sense gun safety laws in the United States of America. You look around the world, and when it comes to these continuous mass shootings and even the daily toll of gun violence, we're uniquely bad. And so it's pretty clear that we need more national gun safety laws. But unfortunately, as the president has said, we don't have the votes. I'd like to take up the bill and pass the ban on semi-automatic assault weapons. We had that in place for 10 years in our country. It lapsed under President George W. Bush, but we need to renew that bill. There are other things we can do to close big loopholes when it comes to gun sales in parts of the country.
But it doesn't sound we can do a lot, but it doesn't sound like anything is actually going to happen.
Well, I guess my point is right. I mean, what is just so angry, what makes me angry about this, right, is because we do have these options. We can do things to make things safer, but we also live in a country where we're a democracy. We don't have the votes. So you ask what people can do, they need to make this a issue when they go to the ballot box. Because if you agree that we need more comprehensive national gun safety laws to better protect our people and protect public safety and kids, then you need to vote for people who are willing to do that, because all it does come down to votes. So when President Biden says to Congress, pass this, I agree with him. But you need the votes to pass it. You need a majority to pass it. And we do not have the votes in the House or Senate to do that right now. So we really need for this to be a voting issue for the American public.
Well, we'll see if that happens the next time around. Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen, thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you.